General Marcus Bennett was a man who carried the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had dedicated over 30 years to the U.S. Army, serving in various missions around the world. Respected for his firmness and sense of justice, he always believed that discipline and character were the greatest qualities a man could have. He had seen firsthand what true power meant. It was not about control or intimidation, but about honor, duty, and respect. That afternoon, Marcus was returning from an important meeting in Washington, D.C. After hours of strategic discussions on national security, he decided to stop at a small convenience store for a cup of coffee before heading home. Dressed in a gray sweatshirt and jeans, he didn't look like a high-ranking officer, at least not to those who judged people solely by their appearance. His car, a sleek black luxury sedan, was parked near the entrance. On the passenger seat rested his military cap and official jacket, adorned with medals that told the story of a man who had served his country with bravery. But none of that would matter in the next few minutes. At that moment, Officer Bradley's patrol car slowly passed by the store. He was merely observing the surroundings, but something caught his attention. A black man walked out of the store, a cup of coffee in hand, and got into a luxury vehicle. For Bradley, that was a suspicious combination. He abruptly parked his car and stepped out with firm strides. He had no information, no tip, no real reason to act. Just an instinct driven by prejudice. "Hey you!" His voice cut through the air like a whip. Marcus stopped, frowning. He looked around, trying to see if the officer was speaking to someone else. But there was no one else. "Wes, is there a problem, officer?" His hands were visible, and his tone was measured. That tone, that way of speaking, he knew it well. He had grown up seeing friends and family in similar situations. Black men stopped, searched, humiliated, simply for existing. But he never imagined it would happen to him. Not after everything he had accomplished. Not after dedicating his life to military service. "Officer, may I ask why you stopped me?" "Don't ask questions. Just comply." Marcus sighed. He could feel the officer's hard stare, analyzing his every move as if he were a dangerous criminal. Calmly, he raised his hands, showing he was no threat. "I just stopped to get some coffee. Vehicle documents. Now." The officer's commanding tone, as if he were addressing a subordinate, made Marcus' blood boil. But he took a deep breath. He knew one wrong word could escalate the situation. Slowly, he reached into his pocket to retrieve his wallet. "Slow down," Bradley shouted, drawing his weapon. Marcus' hand froze mid-air. For a moment his heart pounded. Not out of fear, but indignation. He was a man who had spent his life protecting this country, yet he was being treated like a criminal just for existing. Cautiously, he opened his wallet and pulled out his vehicle registration, along with his military insignia. "Here are my documents." Bradley grabbed the papers without even glancing at them. But when his eyes landed on the military insignia, his brows furrowed. "What's this?" "My insignia. I'm a general in the United States Army." The officer scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're telling me you're a general? That's a good one. General Marcus Bennett. You know how many guys I've seen with fake papers?" Bradley sneered. Marcus pressed his lips together. "Officer, you can verify. My name is Marcus Bennett. You can check the license plate and confirm my identity." But Bradley wasn't interested in verifying anything. He had already made up his mind. To him, this man was lying. "Step out of the car. You're under arrest." What happened next was worse than anything Marcus could have imagined. He felt the cold metal of the handcuffs tightening around his wrists. He kept a firm expression, but inside, a storm of emotions raged. Decades of military service. Years dedicated to protecting his country. Countless sacrifices. And yet, here he was. Treated like a criminal by a man who hadn't even bothered to check the facts. Bradley yanked his arm roughly and led him to the police car. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer said with a satisfied smirk. Marcus said nothing. He had seen men like this before. Men who wore the badge not to protect, but to instill fear. To them, authority meant absolute power. And now, Bradley was relishing this moment, convinced that he had caught a liar. The customers outside the convenience store watched with mixed expressions. Some looked irritated, others stayed silent. A bystander pulled out his phone and started recording. "Hey man, he didn't do anything," a young man shouted. "Shut up and mind your business." Bradley snapped, shoving Marcus against the car. Marcus felt his anger rise, but years of training had taught him control. He wouldn't give this officer what he wanted. A reason to use more force, a justification for this absurd arrest. Inside the police car, Marcus stared out the window, watching Bradley talk to another officer who had just arrived. The second officer looked confused, questioning the arrest, but Bradley gestured as if he had caught a dangerous criminal. Minutes later, the car started moving. Marcus glanced at the dashboard and realized they were heading to the station. When they arrived, he was pulled from the car without explanation. No one questioned him, no one asked for his side of the story. Instead, he was taken inside, fingerprinted, and told to wait in a holding cell. That's when he noticed something strange. Several officers inside the precinct were looking at him oddly. Some seemed uneasy, as if something was wrong. Then, the duty sergeant approached Bradley with a serious expression. "What did this man do?" "Suspicious behavior." Bradley replied with a smug grin. The sergeant frowned. He looked at Marcus, then at the form Bradley had filled out. The moment he saw the name, his face changed. "Did you check his identity?" Bradley rolled his eyes. "He said he's a general in the army, but you know how these guys lie." A chill ran down the sergeant's spine. "Have you checked his papers?" Bradley shrugged. "Why would I?" "Just look at him. Do you realize who this is?" Before he could finish his sentence, the sergeant pulled out his radio and called the precinct captain. "Sir, we have a problem." Bradley stood there, momentarily confused before regaining his arrogance. "What?" "I did my job. This guy was acting suspicious." But the weight of the moment was shifting. Marcus Bennett, a man who had spent his entire life protecting this country, was being treated like a criminal. For the simple fact of existing. With caution, he opened his wallet and took out the vehicle documents along with his military badge. "Here are my documents." Bradley took the papers without even looking at them carefully. But when his eyes fell on the military badge, he frowned. "What is this?" "My badge. I am a general in the U.S. Army." The officer laughed, shaking his head with a mocking expression. "You mean to tell me you're a general? That's a good one. Do you know how many guys I've seen with fake papers?" Marcus pressed his lips together. "Officer, you can verify. My name is Marcus Bennett. You can check the license plate and confirm my identity." But Bradley had no interest in verifying anything. He had already made up his mind. To him, this man was lying. The silence in the police station was deafening. The phone kept ringing, and each passing second seemed to drag Bradley further into an endless abyss. The sergeant hurriedly picked up the call, his voice filled with tension. "Yes, sir. Yes, he's here." "Understood, sir." He hung up and turned to Bradley, who was already pale. "The chief of staff of the army is on his way, and he wants an explanation." Bradley's heart pounded. That name carried too much weight. One of the most powerful men in the military was personally coming to the police station to deal with the imposter he had arrested. His chest puffed up with pride as he tried to hide the fear creeping in. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, as if trying to convince himself. But the sergeant ignored him and ordered Marcus to be released immediately. When the general stepped out of his cell, the officers surrounding him stepped back in shame. He said nothing. He walked to a chair and sat down, his gaze cold and calculating. The suffocating silence around him was unbearable. A few minutes later, the station's doors swung open. 3 men in suits entered, followed by a 4th imposing man in a military uniform. It was General Christopher Reynolds, the chief of staff of the U.S. Army. He scanned the room, his face unreadable. "Where is he?" The sergeant pointed to Marcus, who slowly stood up. General Reynolds walked toward him and, without hesitation, extended his hand. "Marcus, my friend, are you all right?" Bradley held his breath. Marcus shook Reynolds' hand and nodded. "I am now." Reynolds then turned to Bradley and the other officers. "I want to know exactly what happened here." The sergeant exhaled and tried to explain, but Bradley, still scrambling to save himself, interrupted. "Sir, I was just following protocol." He was acting suspiciously. He was driving a luxury car. He refused to obey direct orders. "Did you check his papers?" Reynolds cut in, his voice sharp. Bradley stammered. "Not immediately. I didn't think it was necessary at the time." Reynolds crossed his arms. "So you prejudged a U.S. Army general and threw him in a cell without even verifying his identity?" The officer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. General Reynolds stepped closer, his eyes blazing with indignation. Do you realize the gravity of this situation? You disrespected one of the highest-ranking military leaders in this country, a man who has dedicated his life to protecting this nation. You abused your power. You humiliated a war hero, and worse, you did it for no reason other than your own prejudices. Reynolds' voice grew louder with each word, and everyone in the station seemed to shrink. Tell me, officer, if this man had been white, wearing a suit and tie, would you have done the same? Bradley couldn't answer. His face burned with shame. He tried to look away, but Reynolds' dominant presence crushed him like a concrete wall. Reynolds sighed and shook his head. Your career ends here. The ground seemed to collapse beneath Bradley's feet. What do you mean? You will be immediately dismissed from duty, and an investigation will be opened. If it were up to me, you'd never wear that badge again. The sergeant nodded in confirmation, and before Bradley could protest, 2 officers were already at his sides, ready to escort him out of the precinct. This can't be happening, Bradley muttered, almost out of breath. Yet, it was, and he knew there was no turning back. Marcus watched everything in silence. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to defend himself. Karma had done its work. And now, Bradley was learning the hard way that true power doesn't come from a badge but from integrity. The atmosphere in the police station felt different now. The weight of the truth had fallen upon everyone, and the silence was almost as loud as the authoritative shouts Bradley had given just hours ago. The former cop, because he knew there was no coming back, was escorted to the exit without another word, without resistance. The pride that had swelled his chest had now deflated like a punctured balloon. Marcus took a deep breath. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want to see Bradley destroyed, but he wanted him to understand what he had done. He wanted this man, and everyone else who had stood by with their arms crossed, to know that judging someone based on the color of their skin, their clothing, or the car they drive has consequences. General Reynolds placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Let's get out of here, Marcus. You don't need to stay in this place a second longer. The other officers in the precinct lowered their heads as he walked past. Many were ashamed, others were simply afraid of the repercussions. The phone kept ringing. The news was already spreading. Outside, a crowd had gathered. People who had witnessed the arrest recorded it, shared it on their networks. When Marcus stepped out, a respectful silence settled. Then, one man called out, "Sorry, sir. This should never have happened." Marcus looked at him and nodded, without resentment, certain that a lesson had been taught that day. He got into the car beside Reynolds, who drove in silence for a few minutes before finally speaking. So, what happens now? Marcus looked out the window, watching the city pass by. The faces, the lives, the reality that many still face every day. He smiled slightly. Now we keep fighting. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel for more true stories like this. Share this video so more people know that karma always collects its debts.